Good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin Butterfield, the Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Thrilled to invite you to another exciting book talk here in 2021, our first Ford Evening Book Talk of the year. Excited to spend an hour with you tonight discussing an exciting new book on the American presidency. A couple of upcoming events just around the corner. I won't go too far down the road. On January 19th, we'll have another book talk hosted by Dr. Jim Ambusky with Donald Johnson, historian with a great new book called Occupied America, British Military Rule and the Experience of Revolution. And then on January 27th, I want to tell everyone who hasn't already heard about this exciting event, our Leadership for a More Perfect Union, an event in the afternoon and in the evening on January 27th, free, available to the public, here for you to come on, join us virtually, get to hear talks from people like General Colin Powell, President of Microsoft, Brad Smith, Congresswoman Jane Harman, and so many others. A great event and something that we partnered with the Brookings Institution to put together. Tonight's exciting program is a discussion based on this book, The Man of the People, Political Dissent and the Making of the American Presidency by Nathaniel C. Green. Nate, whom I've known for years, excited to talk with him tonight, is Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College, teaches American history there. Earned his PhD at the same institution I did, not long after I did, at Washington University in St. Louis. And he's a scholar of early U.S. politics with this great work and a look at the first several presidencies, but not necessarily at the presidents. So it's something a little more serious and wide-ranging than that important topic. He's been awarded research fellowships at the White House Historical Association, the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, and most importantly, Nate was a member of the Washington Library 2015-2016 class of fellows, where he did a lot of work on this book. Nate, welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I like to, because we have a national audience, I like to give people a sense of where we are. I'm coming to people from Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. How about yourself?
I am in Arlington, Virginia, just across the river from Washington, D.C.
Great. So I've known about this project, as I hinted in the intro. I've known about your work for some time. We overlapped in graduate school, but this work is something I want you to take us all into the genesis of this. Why did you begin writing this book? I hate to say it, but there have been plenty of books written on the American presidency. So tell us about it.
Well, I've always been fascinated, especially by not just the office, but particularly the cultural power of the office and how we as Americans, understand ourselves really by looking at the presidency, and how we kind of want to see ourselves in the office, want to kind of see the best of our nation in the office. And I wondered, where did that come from? Where did we, because that wasn't inevitable. How did that come to be? And so that's what this book is really doing. It's sort of tracing how the presidency came to be kind of imagined as the ultimate American, the kind of embodiment of our collective, national values, and ultimately tracing how it came to be that, we fight over the presidency so vociferously and so violently. And that really begins in the country's earliest years under the Constitution.
Well, I hadn't thought I might start here, but I was thinking we might talk about the Constitution and the creation of the presidency, but let's actually jump a bit before that.
Mm-hmm.
The Articles of Confederation years. So we have this revolution, we come out of it, and with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, there's still this gap between the peace and independence and the creation of the American presidency under the U.S. Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Where did Americans see themselves? What symbol did they look to in 1784, 5, 6?
Well, there's been some really great work about sort of the Continental Congress and its attempts, to kind of make itself into a symbol that could kind of unite the nation. I'm thinking of Benjamin Irvin's great book, Clothed in Robes of Sovereignty, which I loved, and I read that in graduate school. And in fact, somebody told me, I think you're writing the sequel to that book. And the long and the short of it is that the Continental Congress is never really very very able to sort of establish itself as a symbol of a kind of unified nation, and in fact, division seems to be what is defining this early country after the revolution. That's one of the dilemmas that sort of faces the country as the Constitution is being created in 1787, and then even after it's ratified. Right, the Constitution begins with this "we the people," and the question becomes, is this kind of collective we the people, does it exist, and can it exist? Is it possible for a stronger government, which is really what the Constitution is? It's this plan for a stronger government than the Articles of Confederation calls for. Can this plan of government bind the country together and make us one people, or is it going to threaten the liberties of people? This becomes a question that is very live as the Constitution is being debated in 1787, 88, as the states are convening for ratification.
It occurs to me too, as you describe the important efforts of Congress to sort of position itself as the symbol of an American people, and obviously you're exactly right. It's as easily 13 peoples as it is one people. But it occurs to me as you describe that throughout the war years and even thereafter, George Washington still plays a unifying role long before he's president.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that role?
Yeah, absolutely. Washington is a legend after the war, and he's legendary, of course, because of the way he leads the Continental Army and the way he gives up power after the war, in sort of defiance of a lot of the received wisdom of the day, which held that, if you have power, no one's going to give it up willingly without being forced to. And Washington does exactly that. And this is an image, 1794 image from Amos Doolittle, which shows George Washington here in the middle in profile. And he's surrounded by these linked rings, each of which is identified by a specific state. And part of what's interesting, the context for this, is that this is very reminiscent of another kind of linked rings design from the 1770s that was featured on continental currency. And instead of Washington in the center, of course, it was Congress in the center. And so here has a very similar design, but this time Washington as president is in the center, sort of indicating that Washington, is this potential, unifying figure. But my book tries to make the case that it's not just Washington individually, as crucial as he is to the story, and he is very crucial to this story in a variety of ways. But it's not just Washington individually; it's the office, and much hay is made out of George Washington's ascent to the presidency when he's elected in 1789, and the way that is celebrated. Publicly in newspapers and so forth is something that I discuss at some length in the book to make this point that from an early point in the game, the presidential office becomes this very important site for sort of describing national union. That it is not only possible, but some of the accounts of Washington's election suggest that some of the people who are really celebrating Washington's celebrating the ratification of the Constitution and celebrating Washington's ascent are kind of suggesting that not only is a we the people possible, but it's kind of already in existence. And Washington's unanimous election to the presidency kind of proves that.
This is a good opportunity to tell everyone who's watching live tonight that you can enter in questions that we'll come to sometime later in our conversation and into the comments. And excited to bring some audience questions to you, Nate. But I'm going to spend a little more time with you, walk you forward in time, and we've just brought Washington into the presidency. But let me pause one moment at the creation of that office with the Constitutional Convention in 1787.
Yeah,
there were certainly other possibilities, right? A plural executive, for instance.
Right.
20 states had experimented with that. Could you explain for us what you were able to decipher about the description, the definition of the presidency in those early moments, as it's still just a figment of everyone's imagination?
Well, there are a couple of, there are a variety of different sort of models, ideas that are discussed and debated, throughout the summer of 1787. And there's a number of considerations that are really discussed. One of which, of course, is, the power that this executive is going to give. As you mentioned, Kevin, is it going to be a plural executive, or is it going to be one person? What's the relationship between the executive and the legislature going to be? That's a really important one, because, of course, in the back of their minds are a variety of examples, one of which, of course, is the British monarchy. And some delegates to the convention, probably most notably Alexander Hamilton, kind of think, well, there's a lot about the British system that, is worth admiring, that we might want to think about with regards to our system. And then there's other folks who are much less enthusiastic about that, as an example. And around they go. But, but of course they also have, and we're getting back to Washington again, they have Washington also. Washington is there in the convention. And Washington is sort of the example of someone who is at least capable of wielding power without without it corrupting them. And this notion of how much power should be vested in this office, should it be one person or multiple, all kind of revolve around a question of accountability. And it's that issue that I find especially fascinating, and that I find especially important to this story. How accountable to the people is the executive going to be? And there are some problems with a plural executive that different members of that plural executive can point fingers at one another, making it hard to know who's the problem. And if everybody is guilty, then no one's to blame. And in fact, I think it's Hamilton who talks about this a bit, for the case for a kind of singular executive, because the responsibility, and in the Federalist essays, he talks a lot about responsibility, right? And this notion of accountability to the people becomes a kind of refrain of the Federalists, the people who are advocating for ratification of the Constitution after it's published. And they kind of point to the presidential office as a kind of litmus test for the accountability of the government as a whole. This becomes one way that they talk about the presidency, but they talk about it rather expansively. The point here is to say that, yes, the executive is strong. Yes, the executive is powerful, just like this plan of government is powerful in many ways. But the hallmark of this plan of government is that it is always going to be accountable to the people. And this is actually where, at different points, supporters of ratification do make reference to Washington, and what they'll say here is it's kind of unusual. Some places I've found, they'll say things like, even someone with Washington's illustrious reputation won't be able to use that reputation to abuse the powers of the office. Even if a Washington were to be corrupted by the powers of the executive, the American people would rise as one against him. There are tools in place to address an executive who abuses their power, including impeachment. That is being tested like never before. And but nonetheless, the question of accountability, the Federalists will, there are Federalists who say this government is going to be accountable. Even a Washington, won't be able to abuse their power, because the American people have tools at their disposal within this government to handle that, and they know virtue when they see it. And the sort of dissenting spirit of the American people that won the day in the revolution is what binds us together. This government will be accountable to the people because the presidency is accountable to the people.
And though it took some time, and I don't think Washington abused the powers of the office, but he still became a target of criticism.
Yeah.
After some time had passed over the course of his presidency, it became a fair game to criticize Washington's conduct as president. And there was a lot of political mobilization during the Washington presidency that enabled that to have the energy and the life that it did. I wanted to talk a little bit about the rise of a political opposition party, something that's now an entrenched part of our political system.
Right. Well, and it's well known that George Washington doesn't like political parties. George Washington wants to sort of remain above the partisan fray, and George Washington can never really fully grasp what the mobilization is all about. He doesn't like it. Nobody likes to be criticized, to be fair, and certainly no president likes to be criticized. And you're absolutely right, Kevin. George Washington takes very seriously, that he is the first president. He famously says, "Everything I do is going to be drawn into precedent." He knows that, and that is very much to his credit that he takes it that seriously. But whenever he acts, and particularly a little later on in his presidency, he does draw criticism. There are a variety of what are known as democratic Republican societies that gather throughout the country, and they hold meetings, they drink toasts, they publish their meetings, and that's how we know about them. And they include statements, sometimes statements of patriotism and support, but they also weigh in on the political issues of the day. And there's also a criticism of specific things that Washington does, especially the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty is probably the most controversial thing that Washington's involved with, and this is a treaty with Great Britain, and Washington endorses the treaty, and there are people who don't like the treaty, in part because the stated purpose of it was to address British impressment of Americans on the high seas, and the actual treaty that's completed by Justice John Jay, Chief Justice John Jay, doesn't actually address impressment at all. And there's other objections that critics have of it, but they march in the streets. They publish open letters to George Washington. Some of them can't believe that Washington would actually support it, and this kind of mobilization, as I said, is frustrating for Washington. He does not like it. He frankly doesn't really see it as as productive or really kind of legitimate. But what the critics say is very important, and they frame it not as a faction. We're not a faction. We are the people. And the president is obligated to listen to us. The president is obligated to engage with us as citizens, because we take this very seriously, that the president, and by extension, the government as a whole, is always accountable to the people. And that's what we're doing. We are holding this government to account. That's a very important argument, because it, again, makes the presidential office, not just Washington personally, but the office, very, indicative of the kind of the health of the republic, as a whole. And it's an important chapter in this story, which is really tracing how people outside of the presidency are really the key figures in making the presidential office so emblematic of our country and the way we want to see our representative democracy.
So I could throw you a very short question and say, well, what happened next with John Adams? So let's on the exit of the presidency, Washington famously gives advice to the nation in his farewell address of September 1796. Very much, I think, imagining that he wanted his political vision to outlive him and to outlive his presidency. The election of 1796, as Jeff Pasley famously calls it, it's the first contested election in American history. Yep. It's for those who don't know, it's Adams versus Jefferson. Adams wins, but there will be a rematch. Talk to us a little bit about Adams, his single term as president, and what he came to experience in that office, in its relationship and its accountability to the people.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, the election of '96, I think, is important, and I make some hay out of that election in the book as well. And it's worth saying that this expectation that the president listen to and engage with the people actually is that this perceived relationship between the president and the people is gonna shift over time, and it's actually in some ways the Federalists who start to make that happen in the election of '96. A lot of Federalists are concerned. They're more concerned with Thomas Jefferson being president than they are kind of enthusiastic in some ways about Adams, and they attack Jefferson during the election of '96, and their attacks are very important for us to understand, because the attacks don't just go after Jefferson's public career as an elected official. They attack that, but they also make it quite personal. They call Jefferson a coward. They attack him for being this kind of flaky intellectual who kind of dawdles on these strange projects instead of understanding what real people are up against. And they even, there's some of you even sort of say that he is there's a South Carolina congressman named William Lofton Smith who publishes this series of essays attacking Jefferson, and at one point he even actually quotes at length from a letter that Jefferson writes back to Black mathematician Benjamin Banneker, and basically says that Jefferson is way too sort of cordial to Black people, of all things. Jefferson is sort of not white supremacist enough to be president, and really makes the case that if Jefferson's allowed to be president, all of the things that are to Smith's mind that are toxic about Jefferson and Jeffersonian democracy will kind of radiate outwards from the presidency. So there's an awful lot that's being stated there about sort of the presidency as a cultural symbol, as an embodiment of what Smith thinks America should be. That's at stake in the election of '96. But you're right. Jefferson doesn't win that election. Adams does, and Adams only serves as one in one term. Adams, of course, faces a foreign policy challenge, and that's putting it mildly. And that is the United States finds itself teetering on the brink of war with France. And what I discuss in that chapter on Adams is how the Federalist Party, Adams and other Federalists, really seek to kind of galvanize, public support around the president at a time of crisis, a time when the United States may very well find itself going to war with France. Now, that doesn't actually end up happening, but what I found were a lot of accounts of strident Federalists who are saying that we are ready to take up arms when the president says we need to. If that means going to war with France, that's fine. If that means fighting against people even in this country who are a threat to this country, then so be it. Of course, the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts are a part of this story as well, which vests the president with tremendous power to jail and even to jail people who are speaking out in ways that are deemed to be dangerous or seditious for the government, for the administration, and even to prosecute aliens that are deemed to be enemies of the country. What this does, though, is, and Jeff Pasley has written about this as well. He's a remarkable historian whose work I rely on a lot in my book. This doesn't have the effect of silencing political opposition. In fact, what it does is sort of fuel a Republican backlash. More Republican newspapers start to be published, after the Alien and Sedition Acts are made law, and Republicans throughout the country have an argument of their own, which is this kind of power that is given to the president by these acts is dangerous, and it's dangerous to this notion of responsibility to the people. This is not who we are. There are others who actually criticize Federalists who are in the streets who are saying we support the president no matter what. We're going to support, we're going to take up arms. And there's a remarkable passage from one Republican critic in a newspaper that says, if you are willing to simply do whatever the president wants you to do mindlessly, you are not a citizen. You are a slave, and he uses that term, and it's published in a Virginia newspaper. I mean, it's a remarkable passage. But you have this back and forth, this vicious back and forth, this partisan back and forth, that is all about the powers of the presidency as a reflection of kind of our collective national values. And even as there's Federalists and Republicans agree that there should be these values that we all share, they disagree vehemently on what those are, and that ironically fuels the partisan division, but it also increases the prestige of the presidential office itself. It becomes that much more important to win the presidency because so much is at stake.
We'll sort of blow past the nail-biter election of 1800 and Jefferson's victory over Adams in the rematch, but does Jefferson take a different tack? I'm thinking of his first inaugural address where he essentially says we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, and this seems to be a gesture towards a new effort to unite Americans
Right.
and to move past the partisan divisions of the 1790s. Does Jefferson find a new path?
Well, Jefferson does offer that kind of an olive branch, but it's also a way of making a statement about what the Federalists have been doing to the Republicans during much of the 1790s, and it's a way of signaling that the Republicans are not going to do the same thing. So, I mean, it is in a sense, it is sort of saying that we're going to take a different path. But Jefferson also makes it a point to really say that, now that the people have spoken, now that the election is over and the people have chosen me, now those who I forget exactly how he phrases it, but basically he kind of says that now that the people have spoken, now we all need to kind of come together, and he makes it pretty clear in the things that he says and in the letters that he writes, that when he's talking about we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, he draws a distinction between Federalists who can kind of be convinced that okay, maybe we were wrong about some things, that we can work with Republicans, and the ultras, the ones that can't be sort of reasoned with. And what I find too is that there are a variety of Jeffersonian Republicans who really take Jefferson's election and then his re-election in 1804, which is a resounding victory, as further evidence that Jeffersonian republicanism is right, is sort of quintessentially American, and that the Federalists are kind of fundamentally wrong and in many ways un-American. Over and over again, there are these kinds of passages. There are these accounts where Jeffersonian Republicans are really kind of making the case that Jefferson's ascent to the presidency, signify the kind of culmination of the people finally taking back a government that was rightfully theirs from a Federalist Party that was more interested in replicating the trappings of monarchy than serving the people. And this is going to become, in a lot of ways, the kind of this is what's going to sort of define kind of the debates over the presidency kind of in the future. Jefferson recognizes that more so than his predecessors do, and so describes, and other scholars have talked about this, talks about sort of his power coming from this kind of mandate from the people. But ultimately, what we're also seeing in Jefferson's presidency is a shift towards, again, a more kind of personal relationship culturally. And what I mean by that is many, both Federalists and Republicans, kind of agree that a president, shouldn't just listen to and engage with the people, but should kind of embody who the people are, should kind of reflect their values. And this is where, the attacks on Jefferson get to be very, very personal. They're personal in 1796. They're also very personal when he is president. And this is also going to be, we're going to see this more and more in the future, where the line between public and private is going to be increasingly, blurred and challenged to the point where everything a president does, even the most intimate of choices a president makes, is fair game for criticism, fair game for arguing over what does this portend about our nation.
We're coming up on a time, probably in about 5 minutes or so, that I want to start moving towards audience questions. So let's Jefferson, the potential war with France is long past by the time Jefferson's in his second term. But there are looming issues again with the British. Impressment of sailors, I know, is at the top of mind. And Jefferson and then his successor are both forced to sort of grapple with this at every moment during the presidency of looming conflict with Great Britain, hoping to find solutions. I'm thinking of things like a trade embargo.
The embargo, right?
Talk to us a little bit about the ways in which Jefferson and then his successor, James Madison, who had been his Secretary of State and worked closely with the man, great friends long before they were presidents.
Yeah.
How does that potential conflict with Great Britain and their own experiences, and of course, ultimately there is war, shape up the direction of the presidency in the 1800s and teens?
Yeah. So, I mean, the book really, again, talks about not just these immense challenges that you're describing, Kevin. But also, what I'm focusing on in the book is the sort of the way that a lot of people kind of on the ground are responding to, for example, the embargo or other potential remedies to avoid war. There's a lot of fear and a lot of anger at what the British are doing. There's attacks on American vessels, of course, in the later years of Jefferson's presidency, and there are real fears. There's real division over whether the U.S. will end up going to war. Should war be avoided? And kind of ironically, earlier in Jefferson's presidency, some of Jefferson's greatest kind of accomplishments, especially the Louisiana Purchase, was touted by Jeffersonian Republicans as a very peaceful act, right? This was we expanded the size of our country without a shot being fired. And the Republicans use this as a way to kind of take a shot at Federalists and say, well, these Federalists think the only way we can, do anything for our country is if we, engage in violence, and that's not who we are. And yeah, you're right. By the time we get to the end of Jefferson's presidency and into Madison's presidency, circumstances have really changed. And now more Jeffersonian Republicans are really kind of embracing. Some aren't, but many more are kind of embracing. Well, maybe we have to go to war with Great Britain, and what is that going to mean? And then, of course, Madison finds himself the president as the United States, does go to war, and he and the Jeffersonian Republicans have to make the case for why American citizens should engage in this war. While the Federalists now, during the war, are making the case this war is a bad idea from the start, and humiliation after humiliation, and sort of, when news of horrible things happening as a result of the war seem to confirm what the Federalists are really, are really saying. So now we have getting near the end of the book, we now have this discussion of kind of violence. What is the role of violence in sort of defining the American people? Are we a peaceful people? Are we a people who, should go to war, engage in violence when it's necessary? Is this one of those times? And by the time we get to the very end of the War of 1812, of course, Andrew Jackson is the famous victor, the Battle of New Orleans, and it's a victory that is celebrated widely. And the point that I make, there is to really kind of take the story a little bit further to say that Jackson now becomes someone that people all around the country can some of them or look up to him. He is what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, he's admired, he's celebrated throughout the country, but he's a very controversial figure. But he becomes a person who now, as he becomes in the 1820s, a potential candidate for president, runs for president in 1824, loses, and then wins in 1828. Jackson is a violent person, and Jackson's propensity for violence becomes, and his potential presidency, and then when he becomes president, he becomes the focal point for this really intense conversation about the role that violence plays in sort of defining the American character. Are we a violent people? Is Jackson's violence kind of necessary for to unite us as never before against our enemies, or is he indicative of the violence that by the 1820s and 30s some believe is tearing the country apart?
Was it well known? I'm thinking of his duels and all that. Were all those stories known to the American people as they were voting for him or voting?
So a lot of the campaign literature that I looked at for my chapter on Jackson, what's kind of remarkable is that a lot of the basic kind of contours of Jackson's life are discussed in this literature. It's not a secret, and I find that, in some ways I found it kind of remarkable because, one of the things that is often lamented, today is that we can't agree on what the facts are when we have conversations about stuff. And one of the things I found kind of remarkable when I was looking at the stuff on Jackson in the 1820s and 30s is, the people who loved Jackson, the people who hated him, for the most part, I think generally had a pretty consistent, like they know Jackson, they know who he is, they know what he did. They disagree absolutely about whether those things are worth admiring or not. So they draw very different conclusions about what to make of Jackson's exploits. But it's the on down the line from him as a very young man during the American Revolution to his life as a judge to, of course, New Orleans, slaughter of indigenous people. I mean, that's all discussed.
Well, let me ask before we start moving towards audience questions. Let me ask a tough question, maybe, but a direct one. You mentioned seeing ourselves in the presidency.
Yeah.
And yet, when I stop and think about the first several presidents, George Washington, larger than life, obviously was going to become the first president. But then after that, we're talking about heroic, central to the American Revolution figures like John Adams, author of the Declaration of Independence, father of the Constitution. James Monroe perhaps is starting to become a little closer down to earth, but is still a fairly towering figure.
Right.
How are people seeing themselves in these remarkable human beings?
Well, I mean, the way that these guys are being discussed. What they do, publicly and increasingly privately, becomes the occasion for really commentary on, and this is the word they often use, character, right? And over again, the dilemma that is sort of brought up in these in newspapers, pamphlets, private letters, even, is there seems to be an understanding that what the president does in the character of the president is going to have an effect on the character of the people writ large. It's precisely the kind of hierarchical assumption here kind of plays into this, right? The assumption is people are going to take their cues from their leaders. The American people are going to take their cues from the president. And in that way, it kind of replicates that hierarchy, but it also, in a sense, kind of breaks it down a little bit, because there is some assumption here that, if we have a president who has a terrible character, who is immoral, who is cowardly, who has traits that we consider to be poisonous to our republic. Even though he is a leader, we've chosen him. There seems to be the assumption that it's kind of inevitable that is going to affect everyone else around this country. This is going to have a deleterious effect on the entire nation. As this office goes, so goes the nation. And so there is this, I think you're right, there is this kind of complicated way in which the American people exalt the office. They sort of, and the men themselves, but at the same time, the way that they argue with them, the way that they criticize them and insist on criticizing them as a measure of the sovereignty of the people, they're also kind of pulling them down to say, no, you have to answer to us. And I start actually the book, the prologue, with a remarkable document that I found at the New York Historical Society, and it's a group of Jeffersonian Republicans that are in New York that are writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1808, and they start their letter with the salutation to Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, Esquire, and then they cross it out. And I just say at the beginning, Esquire is this term that's now used by lawyers, but at the time it was a term for gentlemen, people who stand above other men. And someone wrote that term, and then maybe they had a conversation about it. We don't know. Then they crossed it out. They're kind of giving him they're sort of giving him that sort of exalted title, but then taking it away from him. And so I think you're right, Kevin, that there's this interplay between the fact that the president stands above the people and that these early presidents are such remarkable figures. But there's an understanding that their character is going to have a monumental impact on the character of ordinary Americans.
Let's go to a question from the audience. There's something that you mentioned is this phrase accountability. Welcome, Cynthia, to a live stream. It's great to see you again in 2021. To what extent, Cynthia asked, did the notion of accountability in the reality of Washington to his colleagues and the people contribute to the significant dissent amongst the ranks during his terms? So this notion of accountability, is it contributing to the political resistance that you described here? I don't know. Talk to us a little bit about this idea of accountability and Dissent.
Well, yeah, and so I didn't actually talk too much about this notion of dissent. That is in the subtitle to the book, and I should discuss a little bit about what that's all about. So I mentioned at the beginning that this notion of the dissenting spirit of the people is a very important kind of idea after the American Revolution, and I say that in the book that if being an American kind of meant anything to a lot of people in the early United States, what it meant was to be a dissenter. That is, to be someone who dissented against tyranny wherever they found it, to stand up for your liberties when it was threatened. And so this notion of accountability, that the president's accountable to the American people, is directly linked to that. So it absolutely does. In the 1790s, those who criticize Washington, whether we're talking about elite figures, or we're talking about people in the streets, are really saying that we need to hold the president to account. That's what our dissent is. When we are criticizing the president, that's what we're doing. We're doing it because the presidency is the possession of the people. Washington is occupying it, but it doesn't belong to him. And Washington knows that. There's a number of times when the criticism of Washington is actually kind of framed as a kind of admiration. Like we understand Washington's an exceptional person. That's why we gave him this power. But we gave him this power, and we can take it away. And the fact that we can take it away from him is the point. So the president needs to listen to us. And so when we are criticizing, that's what we're doing. We're simply holding this office and the government to account. It's not personal, and in many cases, the people who are criticizing Washington profess to admire him a great deal. Which is why many of them are really surprised when they think Washington is kind of snubbing them, or when Washington is not, when he really isn't giving their criticism its fair due. They're kind of shocked because it seems like, to their mind, he's not holding up his end of the bargain.
Was Adams watching this as vice president, and did that shape Adams's willingness to try to legally silence critics of the presidency?
So I think Adams is observing this. I think Adams gets the material that I find about Adams is that Adams has this pugnacious personality about him, and Adams, I find, I have so much to say about Adams. I have to figure out a way to. So I mean, Adams is observing this stuff, yeah, and Adams has to figure out a way to, act in a way that he believes is right. And in comportment with his duties as the president, but he finds himself under a great deal of criticism as well, and he doesn't like the criticism either. He suspects that certain members of the press, certain printers like William Duane, are really out to get him. He has some pretty some pretty bad things to say about some of these guys. He considers them enemies and foreigners and that sort of stuff. So Adams has his own kind of hangups here, and he does target people in the press. Timothy Pickering becomes kind of the person to kind of go after some of these folks that are deemed to be the ones that are making the most trouble for the administration. So yeah, Adams doesn't respond to this, to the public criticism, in a way that kind of demonstrates that he's listening to his critics and sort of understanding where they're coming from, which is why the response by the Federalists and by Adams is so strong and so strident, and so many Republicans are so alarmed by what the Federalists are doing. It's Adams who, in his response, that really convinces many Republicans that the Republic is at stake.
We have another question that I'd like to talk about without taking us too far into the 21st century.
Right.
Let's talk about the long swath of American history.
Yeah.
Timothy Campbell asked how much of political argument today, when boiled down, is just a continuation of the debates between Jefferson and Hamilton, a strong central government versus a well-decentralized one. I wonder if you could talk about that continuity across American political debate.
Yeah, so to my mind, I mean, what when the focal point of this book, in terms of the cultural power of the presidency, I think that there is a great deal of continuity. I mean, a lot has changed, of course, over the past more than 2 centuries, of course. But we still look to the presidency as a kind of bellwether for our country, and we still. There are kind of these dual elements rather than sort of central versus decentral government. That's important too. But we also, in our political culture, even today, there is on the one hand this kind of this acknowledgement that we're very divided, this acknowledgement that we disagree on a lot of different things, but there's also this kind of aspiration for unity, for coming together to be kind of one people. And part of what I want to get at in the book is to sort of discuss how we tend to think of those two things as opposites when in fact they really kind of fuel each other. The desire for unity is precisely why, kind of fundamentally incompatible visions of America are why they butt heads. And the presidency is a powerful symbol in part because of its singularity, because it's one person who is chosen to represent all Americans. And for that reason and other reasons too, the presidency acts as a site where we hash this out. It's constant, battle. But it's a battle because we, on the one hand, we aspire to this kind of national unity. We still believe, we still want to believe that there is something that holds us together. There is something that unites us all as one people across, regional, state, party lines. But at the end of the day, we are all very, very different. And our vision of what is an American, who counts as an American, who doesn't, those are very, very different, and they remain very different. And frankly, in many ways, incompatible across the board, even to this very day.
I'll note too, it's something that if anyone wants to play around with electoral maps across American history, it's always a fascinating lesson in geography, first of all, but also political geography. And the way, if you look at these early elections, the ones we've been talking about tonight, New England is a block, the South is a block, the middle states are kind of up for grabs. It's pretty remarkable how regional division, as we're talking about a united people, and we've been talking about it the entire time together, as we should. There's still these long-standing and evolving political geographical shifts. But let me not let you comment, because I've got another question from the audience I want to bring in. Scarlett is curious about how Washington and Jefferson handled criticism. A little bit on Washington and maybe a smidge on Jefferson. Let me throw a wrinkle in here. Take us all the way through Jackson. I want to know about Washington, Jefferson, and Jackson, how they handled criticism.
Well, okay. So, again, keep in mind that the focus of the book is really the sort of public debate over these guys. And these guys are a bit in the background. They're still there. They're still very important. One of the conversations that I kept having with my advisor and yours in graduate school was where, you can't have a study of the presidency without the presidents. So Washington, Jefferson, and then you're adding, Jackson to this. Again, none of these guys like being criticized, but they do have different ways to sort of go about it. Washington, at times, does try to communicate with those that are criticizing him. So he issues a response, for example, at one point. To the Boston selectmen during the Jay Treaty controversy. And it becomes a kind of standard answer to their kind of criticisms, of his support for the Jay Treaty. And the fact that he, in that response, he says, the Constitution is a guide which I can never abandon. And that's one of the most famous, kind of lines from Washington. And again, that becomes a kind of stock answer that, he gives over and over again to other people who want to know about his stance on the Jay Treaty. But that actually makes some of his critics rather mad, because to their mind it seems like he's implying that they're not following the Constitution. He's not trying to make them angrier, but it seems to their mind a bit tone deaf. It seems like he's sort of talking down to them rather than engaging with them, who have to see their concerns as legitimate. Jefferson, one of the things that I talk about in Jefferson's presidency is, when he is criticized and attacked at various points. Jefferson knows better than John Adams certainly knows when to keep his mouth shut. One of the most famous kind of attacks on Jefferson, of course, is James Collander's vicious attack on him in 1802, and Jefferson doesn't respond. Later in his presidency, when Jefferson's being criticized, for the embargo, when he's being criticized for his handling of, British aggression towards the United States, I talk about Thomas Jefferson's scrapbook, and Jefferson, keeps tabs on the press, and he has some pretty negative things and places to say about the press. Doesn't like it, but he keeps this scrapbook where it's multi-volume scrapbook. It's at UVA, and he actually pastes articles that about all sorts of things, but he pastes articles about politics. And in certain places, he'll have one Federalist article, but it's kind of surrounded by Republican articles. And I couldn't help but think it's a way for him to physically control a kind of conversation that he actually really can't control in real time. On the page, he can sort of orient these any way he wants, even as he doesn't like what's being said about him. Jackson, Jackson doesn't like criticism at all. And in fact, the fact that Jackson doesn't take any guff from anybody is actually a sort of a point of admiration for those who like him. And you mentioned the political geography. It's worth noting too that Jackson is often kind of associated, of course, with the South and that sort of thing. He's a slave owner and he's from Tennessee, but he has support all over the country. He has support in the West. He has support in even in the Mid-Atlantic, and on down the line. I have sources that are from New Jersey. I have sources from New York. People that are very loyal Jacksonian Democrats in places that you may not initially think if you associate him just with the South. So even in the 1820s, these regions we tend to think of are getting pretty complicated.
We're coming close to the end of our time together, but there's a question that I do want to bring to you from the audience. Cynthia, again, has this, and it's a really insightful one about the role of antiquity and the Roman Republic and what we and early Americans like Thomas Jefferson were able to glean from their study of that period and thinking about leadership and the office of the presidency. Could you speak to that?
There really isn't much that I can say to that. I have to say I don't really talk about that much in the book. There is some good stuff from some other scholars that I've read that talks a little bit about that, but I have to be honest right now. I'm not really kind of recalling a lot of the specifics well enough to really be able to give you a really satisfying answer. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to punt on that one.
Not at all. This is where audience questions can catch us all by surprise. But on this point, I think there is Washington too, although he didn't read Greek and Latin the way Jefferson did.
Right,
was mindful of and read voraciously in leadership in that period, and particularly the tensions between democracy and singular leadership, right? I mean, Caesar's story is certainly one of that, and that tension is one that I think is something that is apparent in your book as well. Mm-hmm. I've got time for two more questions, Nate, if you'll spend time with us to get us to the hour. Lisa Orson is asking about was there ever an aha moment when you felt like you really knew the men that you're studying here, and I'll actually speak for you that you're also studying how people are thinking about these men as much as they are the holders of the office themselves. But it's always a great question, and one of my very favorites to ask authors. What surprised you as you were diving into this book? Is there something that jumps out at you as an aha moment where you had a realization?
I don't really know that there was sort of one aha moment exactly. There were a variety of moments, though, where I found certain things that I just thought were great sources, kind of in unexpected places. One of the images, this doesn't exactly answer the question, but it's kind of a fun story to tell anyway. I was actually at one of this in the before times, a couple of years ago. I was for Father's Day. I was on my own in one of the museums in Washington, D.C., and I happened to see in one of the exhibits on the presidency, I think it's the National Portrait Gallery, one of the image that's on the cover of the book. I saw that image, and I'd never seen it before, and I said, "Oh man, this is remarkable."
Right?
Yeah, it's 1812. It's called the First Great Western Empire. Jonathan Clark, and I saw that image and I just went, wow, I need to get my hands on that. And I spent the rest of the day tracking that image down. And it's at the rare book collection at the Library of Congress, and I requested it. They brought it out, and I was able to analyze it. Tracking down, and I had never seen it before, but I just tracking down images, diaries. I found a remarkable diary at the American Antiquarian Society for a person who he keeps just meticulous track of really local politics in New York, but also kind of on a national scope, and reading how he is kind of describing the kind of partisan rancor of the era. Just remarkable. Not so much a one single aha moment, but just every single piece that I found challenged me in new ways. Okay, this is a part of the story. How does it fit? And how does it fit alongside so many other pieces that I'm finding here? So it was a real challenge to research this book, but it was remarkably rewarding to find those kinds of things when I found them.
Well, we can tell you enjoy the subject. It's been exciting to talk with you. There's one more question from the audience that I think is a great place to bring us towards the end here.
Yeah,
it gives you an opportunity to talk about your students and about the way that you communicate and share your work outside of book talks like this.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about teaching the founding era, the history of the early republic at Northern Virginia Community College.
Well, I feel so lucky to teach at Northern Virginia Community College. The students there are remarkable, and they ask such great questions. That is what I remember, noting very early on in my career there, the questions that the students asked, their desire to learn. And so I would bring in stuff that I had found. I would, in particularly the images that I found, some of which, you've shared, others that are in the book that we didn't get to talk about tonight. I would share those with them as a way to, jump off with conversations. I find these images to just be so rich. They were also, my students were also really great at letting me road test ideas. I told them that, I'm studying this stuff. I love this stuff. And this is how history works. We read these sources. We talk to each other about what we see in them. And I want you to ask me questions. I want you to challenge me. If something, if you have another idea, share it. That's what this is all about. And consistently, my students do just a remarkable job with that. And a lot of them, they're taking a survey course. That's what I teach. So this is the first college course they've taken. Some students, this may be the the first college course they've ever taken, or the first college course they've taken in a while. But they ask such good questions. They're so eager to learn, and it's a privilege to work there each and every day, right outside of Washington, D.C., which means I get access to all of this wonderful stuff, and the Mount Vernon Library, which I visit whenever I can to do more research. And I look forward to visiting you guys again as soon as I possibly can.
I'm so glad to hear that, Nate. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for writing this book and for talking with us about it. The Man of the People, published by the University of Kansas Press. Exciting book about not just the presidency and the people who held it, but about how we think about ourselves as a people. Outstanding to talk with you, Nate. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. We hope to see you again very soon. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.